The email arrived at exactly 9:30 a.m. Effective immediately, Leona Hartwell has been relieved of her duties as Senior Compliance Director and reassigned to administrative support. My hands didn't shake as I read it. They should have. Most people would have panicked, maybe cried, started packing their desk. But there was something my new boss, Richard Castellano, didn't know when he sent that email. Something his vendor partner, James Sutherland, definitely didn't know. The $2.4 billion capital fund they were celebrating, the one they just unlocked by removing me from my position. Every single approval workflow, every authorization gate, every compliance checkpoint ran through systems I personally architected. And I hadn't transferred administrative access yet. The demotion would be official in 6 hours. I had until 3:30 p.m. to decide what kind of person I wanted to be. What happened next changed everything about how I saw corporate integrity. If stories like this matter, hitting that subscribe button helps more than anyone realizes. The goal is 5,000 subscribers, people who believe the truth still matters in places where money talks loudest. Stick around for what comes next. My name is Leona Hartwell, and up until 9:30 that Tuesday morning, I was the Senior Compliance Director for Thornfield Capital, a mid-tier private equity firm in downtown Chicago. Senior Compliance Director sounds impressive until someone explains it means being the person everyone hates when deals don't go through. My father ran a hardware store in Carbondale for 37 years. Not the corporate kind, the type where he knew which customer needed 3/4-inch copper fittings every other Thursday and who was building a deck for their daughter's wedding. He taught me something that seemed old-fashioned even then. Your name means something, and once it's attached to dishonesty, no amount of money can buy it back. That upbringing didn't make me poor. It made me understand that empathy isn't weakness. It's knowing the difference between rules that protect people and rules that protect profits. By the time I was 32, I'd built a reputation in financial compliance that firms actively recruited. Thornfield brought me on specifically because their last audit had been, diplomatically speaking, a disaster. I spent 3 years building systems they could actually be proud of. Richard Castellano destroyed that in 3 weeks. The trouble started on a Wednesday in late September. Not with shouting or obvious corruption, those things are easy to spot. It started with a vendor application that landed on my desk at 2:17 p.m., marked Priority Expedite Review. The company was called Sentinel Verification Systems. On paper, they provided security credentialing and background verification services for financial institutions. The proposal was straightforward. Thornfield would contract them to handle all third-party vendor security clearances, employee background checks, and facility access credentialing. Annual contract value, $340,000. Small enough not to trigger executive committee review, large enough to matter. I started with the standard compliance checklist. Business registration, clean. Corporate structure, standard Delaware C Corp. References, 3 mid-sized firms in Atlanta and Denver, all confirmed legitimate relationships. Then I got to their licensing documentation. Sentinel claimed to hold a security services license from the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation, required for any company performing background investigations for financial institutions. They'd included a PDF of the license in their application package. Something felt wrong about it immediately. Not obviously. The layout looked correct, the seal appeared authentic, the signature seemed legitimate. But the file properties showed it had been created 8 days ago. A license issued 14 months prior, according to its face, shouldn't generate a digital file created last week unless someone had rescanned it. So I called the department directly. "I'm showing a Sentinel Verification Systems inquiry," the licensing clerk said after a 5-minute hold. "Can you provide their license number?" I read it from the document. SV-2847IL-22. Keyboard clicks, then silence. "Ma'am, that number was issued to Sentinel Vanguard Solutions, a security firm based in Naperville. They provide armed transport services. The license you're describing doesn't match our records for any Sentinel verification entity." My stomach dropped. So Sentinel Verification Systems doesn't hold an active license? Not in Illinois, not under that business name. If they're operating without proper credentials and claiming otherwise, that's something our enforcement division would want to know about. I thanked her, hung up, and immediately drafted a rejection memo. Vendor application denial, Sentinel verification system's reason, falsified licensing documentation, failure to meet regulatory requirements status. Rejected, do not onboard, flag for potential fraud investigation. I sent it to our vendor management team, copied our legal department, and marked it closed. That should have been the end of it. At 8:47 a.m. the next morning, I got a calendar invitation I hadn't requested. Vendor discussion, Sentinel verification, scheduled for 10 a.m. in Conference Room C. Organizer, Richard Castellano, Chief Operating Officer. Richard had joined the firm 6 weeks earlier, brought in by our CEO to streamline operations and accelerate growth. He had the resume, Columbia MBA, 10 years at a major consulting firm, 2 successful turnarounds at mid-sized investment companies. He also had the personality of someone who viewed every conversation as a negotiation he intended to win. I'd interacted with him exactly 3 times. Each time, he'd made it clear he thought compliance was an obstacle, not a safeguard. I arrived at Conference Room C at 9:58 a.m. Richard was already there, along with James Sutherland, who introduced himself as the founder and CEO of Sentinel Verification Systems. James had silver hair styled too perfectly, a suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and a handshake that lasted 2 seconds too long. Everything about him projected confidence that bordered on arrogance. "Leona, thank you for joining," Richard began, his tone suggesting my attendance wasn't optional. James came in this morning very concerned about the rejection notice his company received. I thought we should discuss it directly. I kept my voice level. The rejection was based on falsified licensing documentation. Sentinel verification doesn't hold the required Illinois Security Services license. The document they submitted was fraudulent. James smiled like I just told a charming joke. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. We operate under multiple business entities for different service lines. The licensing is held under our parent corporation, Sentinel National Group. It's a common corporate structure. Then the application should have disclosed that structure and provided the correct licensing under the operating entity," I replied. "It didn't, and when I verified with the state, the license number on your document belongs to a completely different company." "Administrative error," James said, waving a hand dismissively. "Our compliance coordinator must have pulled the wrong file. We can provide updated documentation by end of business today." Richard leaned forward. "So this can be resolved with corrected paperwork. If the corrected paperwork is legitimate and verifiable, and if Sentinel can explain why they submitted fraudulent documentation in the first place, then we can restart the vendor review process," I said carefully. "But given the falsification, I'd recommend enhanced due diligence and a probationary period before." "That seems excessive," Richard interrupted. "James has explained it was an administrative error. Mistakes happen, Leona. The whole point of this conversation is to solve problems, not create barriers." There it was. The real purpose of this meeting wasn't discussion, it was pressure. "With respect, falsified government licensing documentation isn't a minor paperwork error," I said. "It's a serious red flag that requires." "I've reviewed the contract terms," Richard cut me off again. "The services Sentinel provides would significantly reduce our vendor management overhead and improve our security credentialing timeline. The ROI is substantial. We need to move forward on this." James sat back, saying nothing, watching this play out with the expression of someone who'd seen this dynamic before. I chose my words carefully. My role is to ensure Thornfield doesn't engage with vendors who present compliance risks. Sentinel has presented such a risk. Until that's resolved to compliance standards, I can't approve the onboarding. Richard's expression hardened. "Can't or won't? Can't ethically, won't professionally." The room went silent for a long moment. "We'll revisit this," Richard finally said. "Thank you for your time, Leona." I was dismissed. I didn't trust it. Not the explanation, not the timing, not the way Richard had immediately jumped to defend a vendor he supposedly just met. So I started digging. Sentinel Verification Systems had a clean corporate website, professional marketing materials, and what appeared to be a legitimate business operation. But when I pulled their corporate registration, something interesting appeared. The company had been incorporated only 19 months ago. For a firm claiming to serve multiple financial institutions, that was remarkably recent. I cross-referenced their listed references. The 3 companies they'd named all confirmed they'd worked with Sentinel, but when I asked for details, the relationships were minimal. One had used them for a single background check contract that lasted 4 months. Another had engaged them for facility access credentialing at one location. The third couldn't provide specific details, but confirmed some vendor relationship. None of them were the established, ongoing partnership Sentinel's proposal had implied. Then I searched for James Sutherland. His LinkedIn showed an impressive career, senior roles at major security firms, consulting positions, advisory board memberships. But when I started verifying the details, the timeline didn't match. He claimed to have been VP of Operations at Garrison Security Solutions from 2015 to 2018. Garrison's actual press releases from that period listed someone named Walter Brennan in that role. His claimed MBA from Northwestern, the alumni directory had no record of a James Sutherland graduating in the year he'd listed. Either this was a different James Sutherland, or significant portions of his professional background were fabricated. I documented everything and sent a confidential memo to our general counsel, Elizabeth Morneau, outlining the concerns. Elizabeth had been with the company for 9 years and had supported every major compliance initiative I'd implemented. She responded within 30 minutes. "Let's meet tomorrow morning, 7:30 a.m., before office hours. Don't discuss this with anyone else yet." That night, I barely slept. Elizabeth was waiting in her office when I arrived at 7:28 a.m., 2 coffees already on her desk. She slid one toward me as I sat down. "I spent last night reviewing everything you sent," she said without preamble. "You're right to be concerned, but there's something you need to know." My chest tightened. "Richard came to me 3 days ago," Elizabeth continued. "He asked about the process for overriding compliance rejections in vendor onboarding situations. Specifically, whether operational necessity could supersede compliance concerns for service contracts under $500,000. What did you tell him?" "That compliance authority exists specifically to prevent operational pressure from overriding risk assessment. That your decisions in vendor management are final unless there's evidence of clear procedural error." She paused. "He didn't like that answer. He's going to push this." "He already is. I got a meeting request this morning from him and our CEO, Arthur Livingston. It's scheduled for 9 a.m. The subject line is compliance process efficiency." We both knew what that meant. At 8:55 a.m., Elizabeth and I walked into Arthur Livingston's corner office. Arthur had founded Thornfield Capital 17 years ago and grown it from a 3-person operation to managing $2.4 billion in assets across 12 fund vehicles. He was demanding but fair, and he'd always supported the compliance infrastructure I'd built. Richard was already seated across from Arthur's desk, a leather portfolio open in front of him. "Elizabeth, Leona, thanks for joining," Arthur began. "Richard has raised some concerns about vendor onboarding efficiency. I wanted to discuss them with everyone present." Richard didn't waste time. "We're losing competitive advantage because our compliance processes are too rigid. The Sentinel situation is a perfect example. A vendor that could provide immediate value, rejected over what amounts to a paperwork discrepancy. In today's market, that kind of inflexibility is costly." I opened my mouth to respond, but Elizabeth spoke first. "The rejection wasn't over a paperwork discrepancy," she said calmly. "It was over falsified government licensing documentation and a pattern of misrepresented credentials. Those aren't efficiency questions, they're fraud indicators." Richard shifted his approach. "James Sutherland has provided corrected documentation. The licensing is valid, the business structure is legitimate. Leona's initial concerns have been addressed, but she's refusing to reconsider the application." "I haven't received any corrected documentation," I said immediately. Richard pulled a folder from his portfolio and slid it across Arthur's desk. "James sent this to me yesterday evening. Complete licensing verification, corporate structure documentation, and a letter from their legal counsel explaining the initial error." I took the folder and opened it. Inside was a new license document, a corporate organization chart, and a 2-page letter on law firm letterhead. The license looked more professional than the first one. The number was different, SV-9214IL-23. The corporate chart showed Sentinel Verification as a subsidiary of Sentinel National Group, which held various security and investigation licenses. But something still felt wrong. "This needs to be independently verified," I said. "I'll need to confirm the license with the state, verify the corporate structure with public filings, and validate the law firm's representation." "How long will that take?" Arthur asked. 48 to 72 hours for complete verification." Richard leaned forward. "And this is exactly the problem. Every decision becomes a 3-day research project. Meanwhile, we're paying premium rates to our current vendor credentialing service, and our onboarding timelines are double the industry average." Arthur looked at me. "Leona, I understand thoroughness, but Richard has a point about efficiency. If the documentation appears legitimate, can we move forward with a provisional approval while you verify?" It was a reasonable question from someone who didn't spend every day looking at how fraud happens. "Provisional approval creates precedent," I said carefully. "If we onboard Sentinel and I later discover the documentation is still falsified, we've already integrated them into our security infrastructure. The risk exposure at that point is significantly higher. But if the documentation is legitimate, we've delayed a valuable relationship over excessive caution," Richard countered. Arthur was quiet for a long moment, looking between us. "Here's what we'll do," he finally said. "Leona, you have until Monday morning to complete your verification. If everything checks out, we move forward. If you find problems, we reject permanently. That's 72 hours, enough time for thoroughness but not indefinite delay." It wasn't the answer I wanted, but it was fair. "Understood," I said. Richard smiled slightly. He thought he'd won. I went straight back to my office and started verification immediately. First, the license. I called the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation again, this time asking for the supervisor I'd been transferred to during my first inquiry. "I'm calling to verify a security services license," I told him. "Number SV-9214IL-23, issued to Sentinel National Group." One moment. The hold music played for nearly 4 minutes. "Ma'am, I'm showing that license number as active, issued to Sentinel National Group, Incorporated in July of last year." Relief started to wash over me until he continued. "But there's a notation on the account. The license is currently under administrative review following a complaint filed by a former client. The review is examining whether services were performed outside the license scope." "What kind of services?" "I can't provide specifics, but the complaint involves allegations of unauthorized data access and privacy violations. The review has been ongoing for 6 weeks. That relief vanished. "Is the license still valid during the review?" "Technically, yes, until a determination is made. But we generally recommend institutions avoid engaging with license holders under active investigation." I thanked him and immediately moved to the next step, verifying the law firm that had written the explanatory letter. The letterhead said Blackstone and Rivers LLP, Corporate Counsel. I searched for the firm and found a small practice in Schaumburg with 4 attorneys. Their website listed corporate formation, contract review, and small business representation as their primary services. I called the main number. "Blackstone and Rivers, how may I direct your call?" "I'm hoping to speak with someone regarding a client letter that was provided to our company. The client is Sentinel National Group." "One moment, please." After a brief hold, a man's voice came on the line. "This is Thomas Blackstone. How can I help you?" "Mr. Blackstone, my name is Leona Hartwell with Thornfield Capital. We received a letter on your firm's letterhead regarding Sentinel National Group and a licensing matter. I wanted to verify its authenticity." There was a pause. "When was this letter dated?" I checked the document. 3 days ago, October 12th. "And what did it pertain to?" "An explanation of a licensing documentation error in a vendor application." Another pause, longer this time. "Miss Hartwell, we did provide corporate formation services for Sentinel National when they incorporated, but we haven't represented them actively in over 8 months. We certainly didn't draft any letters this week." My heart started pounding. You didn't write a letter explaining licensing documentation issues? No, and if someone is using our letterhead for correspondence we didn't author, that's a serious problem. Can you send me a copy of what you received? I scanned and emailed it immediately. While I waited for his response, I pulled up the Illinois Secretary of State's corporate database and searched for Sentinel National Group. The corporate registration was active, but the registered agent listing caught my attention, James Sutherland, with an address in Northbrook. I cross-referenced that address. It was a UPS store mailbox location. My email pinged. Thomas Blackstone's response: "That signature is forged. It's close to my actual signature, but I didn't sign this document and my firm didn't draft it. I'm reporting this to the Illinois Attorney General's office immediately." I sat back in my chair, my pulse racing. Falsified law firm correspondence, a license under investigation, a registered agent using a mailbox service, and Richard Castellano pushing hard for approval. None of this was coincidence. I needed to understand Richard's connection to this. The pressure he was applying wasn't normal operational advocacy, it was personal. I started with basic background research. Richard's LinkedIn showed his tenure at Stratford Consulting Group before joining our firm. I searched for news about Stratford and found something interesting. 8 months ago, they'd been named in a lawsuit by a pension fund client alleging fraudulent vendor relationships that inflated operational costs. The lawsuit claimed Stratford had recommended specific vendors to clients, failed to disclose that those vendors were paying kickbacks to Stratford executives, and structured contracts to maximize fees rather than client value. The case had been settled confidentially, with no admission of wrongdoing, but 3 senior Stratford executives had left the company shortly after. Richard was one of them. I dug into the lawsuit filings that were public record before the settlement. Buried in the exhibits was a list of vendors allegedly involved in the kickback scheme. One of them was Sentinel Verification Systems. My hands went cold. I pulled Richard's employment agreement with Thornfield. Executive contracts were kept in a shared file system I had compliance access to. Most of it was standard: salary, equity participation, benefits, non-compete terms. But there was an attachment I almost missed: a consulting agreement addendum. It authorized Richard to maintain advisory relationships with up to 3 outside business entities for purposes of industry expertise development, provided such relationships don't create conflicts with firm operations. One of the listed entities was SNG Consulting Services. I searched for SNG Consulting. It was registered in Delaware 2 years ago. The principal officer was listed as J. Sutherland, James Sutherland. Richard had a contractual business relationship with the owner of the company he was pressuring me to approve. I documented everything, compiled it into a single report, and sent it to Elizabeth with a subject line: "Urgent potential COO conflict of interest." She called me 30 seconds later. "Are you absolutely certain about this?" Her voice was tight. "Every piece is verified. The lawsuit, the vendor connection, the consulting relationship, it's all documented. This is serious, Leona. If you're right, Richard has violated his employment agreement and possibly engaged in fraud. But if there's any mistake in this research, it's going to come back on you hard." "I'm certain." "Then we need to take this to Arthur immediately. But understand, Richard is his direct hire. Arthur brought him in personally. This is going to be complicated." We scheduled an emergency meeting for 5 p.m. At 4:47 p.m., 13 minutes before our scheduled meeting with Arthur, my office phone rang. "Leona Hartwell?" "Leona, it's Arthur. I need to reschedule our 5 p.m. meeting. Something's come up that needs immediate attention. Can we push to tomorrow morning, 8 a.m.? My stomach dropped. "Of course. Is everything all right?" "Just scheduling conflicts. See you tomorrow." He hung up before I could respond. I immediately called Elizabeth. "Arthur just canceled." "I know, he called me too. Said something came up, didn't provide details." "You think Richard got to him first?" "I don't know, but we proceed as planned. Tomorrow morning, we present everything." I stayed late that night, triple-checking every piece of evidence, making sure the documentation was airtight. I left the office at 8:30 p.m., drove home, ate a dinner I barely tasted, and lay in bed staring at the ceiling until exhaustion finally pulled me under around midnight. My alarm went off at 6 a.m. I showered, dressed, and was about to leave when my phone buzzed with an email notification. The sender was Richard Castellano. The subject line, "Organizational restructuring effective immediately." My hands shook as I opened it. After careful review of operational efficiency and organizational structure, effective immediately, the following changes are being implemented. Leona Hartwell is being reassigned from Senior Compliance Director to Administrative Support Specialist, reporting to the Operations Department. This change reflects a restructuring of compliance functions to better align with business growth objectives. Compliance, oversight responsibilities will be absorbed into the legal department under General Counsel Elizabeth Morno, with vendor management approvals escalated to COO review for contracts exceeding $100,000. These changes are effective as of 9:30 a.m. today. Leona, please meet with HR at 10 a.m. to discuss your new role and responsibilities. I read it 3 times, demoted, stripped of authority, reassigned to a role that eliminated my ability to block the Sentinel approval, and the vendor management approval authority given to Richard himself. The email had been sent at 9:30 a.m. I checked the timestamp on my phone. 9:33 a.m. I'd been demoted 3 minutes ago. My phone rang. "Elizabeth, tell me you're seeing this email," she said immediately. "I'm seeing it. This is retaliation, Leona. Clear, obvious retaliation for your investigation. We're going straight to Arthur. The email says it's effective immediately. By the time we get to Arthur, I won't have compliance authority anymore. Your authority doesn't come from a title, it comes from what you know. Get to the office. We're fighting this." I grabbed my keys and drove to the firm faster than I should have, my mind racing. Richard had moved first. He'd restructured the organization to remove me before I could present evidence of his conflict of interest. It was bold, aggressive, and probably exactly what James Sutherland had advised him to do. But there was one thing Richard didn't know. One piece of leverage he hadn't accounted for. When I built Thornfield's compliance infrastructure 3 years ago, I didn't just create policies and procedures. I architected the entire technological framework that governed how money moved, how approvals were granted, how fund operations were executed. Every wire transfer over $50,000 required dual authorization, one from the requesting department, one from compliance review. Every new investment required compliance sign-off before funds could be deployed. Every vendor payment over $25,000 triggered a compliance checkpoint. And every single one of those technological controls ran through a system I had designed, implemented, and maintained administrative access to. Administrative access that hadn't been transferred to anyone else yet. I arrived at the office at 10:12 a.m., deliberately missing the HR meeting. I went straight to my office. They hadn't locked me out yet, and logged into the compliance management system. The vendor approval workflow for Sentinel verification was already in progress. Richard had initiated it at 9:35 a.m., 5 minutes after my demotion email. The contract value was listed as $340,000. The approval path routed directly to him, bypassing the compliance checkpoints that normally would have flagged it. But the system still required final administrative authentication before the vendor could be activated in the payment systems. That authentication was locked to my credentials. I opened the fund management dashboard. The firm's entire $2.4 billion in assets under management flowed through integrated systems that I'd connected to compliance controls. 12 separate fund vehicles, hundreds of portfolio companies, thousands of transactions monthly, all of it governed by authorization protocols that required compliance validation. Validation that still required my access to override or modify. Richard had removed my title, but he hadn't removed my system access. And until someone with equivalent technical permissions manually reconfigured every single control I'd built, a process that would take days, maybe weeks, I still held the keys to the entire operation. My desk phone rang. Internal extension from HR. I didn't answer. Instead, I opened my email and drafted a message to Arthur Livingston, Elizabeth Morno, and the Thornfield Board of Directors. I attached every piece of evidence I'd compiled. The falsified Sentinel documentation, the lawsuit connecting Richard to vendor kickback schemes, the consulting relationship between Richard and James Sutherland, the forged law firm letter, the license under investigation. Then I added one more thing. A screenshot of the compliance system dashboard showing Richard's attempt to approve Sentinel's vendor status, along with a system architecture diagram highlighting that all fund operations still required my administrative authentication. The subject line: Urgent, COO conflict of interest, vendor fraud, and operational security. I wrote one paragraph. At 9:30 a.m. this morning, I was demoted and removed from compliance authority after discovering evidence that COO Richard Castellano has undisclosed financial relationships with a vendor he is attempting to force through approval despite documented fraud indicators. The attached evidence demonstrates a pattern of falsified credentials, forged legal documentation, and conflict of interest violations. As of this moment, all compliance system controls remain under my administrative access. No fund operations, vendor payments, or investment deployments can proceed without authentication I am not currently providing. This situation can be resolved one of two ways: immediate investigation of the allegations I've documented, or complete operational shutdown until system access is manually reconfigured. The choice belongs to leadership. My finger hovered over the send button. This was it. The moment that would define everything that came after. Send this email, and I'd be burning bridges, probably ending my career at Thornfield, possibly facing legal retaliation. But I'd also be protecting the integrity of a $2.4 billion fund and everyone who'd invested their trust in it. I thought about my father's hardware store, about knowing customers by name, about building trust through consistency, about the value of a reputation earned through honesty. I clicked send. The response was faster than I expected. At 10:47 a.m., my office door opened. Elizabeth walked in, followed by Arthur Livingston. Arthur's expression was unreadable. "Leona, we need to talk. I assume everyone received my email. The board is reading it now. I need you to walk me through every piece of evidence, every claim, every connection you've made. And I need complete honesty. Is there anything you've included that isn't absolutely verifiable?" For the next 90 minutes, I went through everything. The timeline of Sentinel's application, the falsified initial license, the verification calls, the forged law firm letter, the lawsuit against Stratford Consulting, Richard's consulting agreement, the connection to James Sutherland. Arthur took notes, asked pointed questions, and showed no emotion. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. "Elizabeth, legal opinion?" he finally asked. "If Leona's research is accurate, and I've verified several pieces independently this morning, Richard violated his employment agreement by failing to disclose a material conflict of interest," Elizabeth said. "The vendor documentation issues constitute fraud, and the retaliation against Leona for compliance activities is textbook wrongful demotion." Arthur turned to me. "The system access situation. You've locked down fund operations?" "I haven't locked anything down," I clarified. "The systems are operating normally, but any new approvals, vendor activations, or process modifications require administrative authentication that only I currently have credentials to provide. Richard's restructuring didn't account for the technical implementation. So you're holding the fund hostage? I'm ensuring compliance controls aren't bypassed by someone with undisclosed conflicts of interest." Arthur's jaw tightened. "That's a very fine line, Leona. So is demoting someone for doing their job." He stood up, walked to the window, and looked out over downtown Chicago for what felt like an eternity. "Elizabeth, convene an emergency board meeting for 2 p.m. today," he finally said. "I want every board member present, in person if possible, by phone if not. Tell them it's regarding executive misconduct and operational security." He turned back to me. "Leona, until this is resolved, you are not demoted, you are not reassigned, and you maintain full compliance authority. Consider Richard's restructuring email void, but you need to restore normal system operations. Once Richard's vendor approval attempt is formally rejected and his system access to compliance workflows is suspended, operations can continue normally." Arthur looked at Elizabeth. "Can we do that? We can suspend his access immediately pending investigation." "Do it." Arthur headed for the door, then paused, Leona, you took an enormous risk with that email. I want you to understand that. I know. Good. Because if any piece of this falls apart, the consequences will be significant. He left. Elizabeth exhaled slowly. That went better than I expected. It's not over yet. No. But you just went head-to-head with a COO and didn't blink. That counts for something. At 1:53 p.m., I was escorted to the main conference room where the board of directors was assembling. 7 members total, 4 in person, 3 by video conference. Arthur sat at the head of the table. Richard was conspicuously absent. This is an emergency session called to address allegations of executive misconduct, Arthur began. Leona Hartwell, our senior compliance director, has presented evidence suggesting our COO, Richard Castellano, has engaged in undisclosed conflicts of interest and retaliated against compliance personnel. Leona, please present your findings. I walked them through everything again, more formally this time, displaying documents on the main screen, citing specific policy violations, explaining the timeline. When I finished, board member Harold Westbrook, a retired investment banker who'd been with the firm since its founding, spoke first. These are serious allegations. Has Mr. Castellano been given an opportunity to respond? He's being interviewed separately by outside counsel right now, Elizabeth said. We retained an independent investigator this morning. And the vendor in question, Sentinel Verification, what's their status? Application rejected, permanently, I said. They've also been reported to the Illinois Attorney General's Office for Fraud. Another board member, Christine Valdez, leaned forward. Leona, I want to understand the system access situation. You essentially shut down fund operations to force this investigation? I didn't shut anything down. Normal operations continue normally. But I prevented unauthorized approval of a fraudulent vendor relationship and protected compliance infrastructure from being bypassed. The systems I built have administrative safeguards specifically to prevent this kind of situation. That sounds like leverage, Christine said. It's governance, I replied. The whole point of compliance architecture is to ensure no single person, including me, can circumvent controls. But those controls are only effective if they're enforced when pressure is applied. Harold nodded slowly. She's right. We hired her specifically to build those safeguards after the last audit debacle. If we undermine her for using them, we're defeating the purpose. The discussion continued for another 40 minutes. Questions about Richard's hiring process, about vendor management procedures, about how this situation had developed so quickly. Finally, Arthur called for a vote. The board needs to decide. Do we proceed with a full investigation of Richard Castellano, or do we treat this as an internal operational disagreement? The vote was unanimous. Full investigation. Second question, Arthur continued. Leona's demotion. Do we uphold Richard's restructuring or reverse it? 6 votes to reverse, 1 abstention. It's reversed, Arthur declared. Leona, you're restored to full authority and position, effective immediately. The relief that washed over me was overwhelming, but I kept my expression neutral. Final question, Arthur said. Richard's employment status pending investigation. I move for suspension with pay until the investigation concludes, Harold said. Seconded, Christine added. The vote was 5 in favor, 2 for immediate termination. Suspended with pay pending investigation results, Arthur announced. This meeting is adjourned. The independent investigation took 11 days. During that time, I restored normal system operations, worked with it to create redundant administrative access protocols, and rebuilt vendor management workflows with additional safeguards. James Sutherland's Sentinel verification systems ceased operations on day 4 of the investigation. After the Illinois Attorney General's office launched a formal fraud inquiry, the company's website went dark, the phone numbers disconnected, and James himself became suddenly unreachable. On day 7, investigators discovered that Richard had received $85,000 in consulting fees from SNG Consulting Services over the past 14 months, payments that hadn't been disclosed to Thornfield despite his employment agreement requiring such disclosure. On day 9, they found email correspondence between Richard and James discussing revenue-sharing arrangements for vendor contracts James's companies secured through Richard's influence. On day 11, the investigation concluded. The report was damning. Richard had violated his employment agreement, engaged in undisclosed conflicts of interest, attempted to force through a fraudulent vendor relationship, and retaliated against an employee performing legitimate compliance functions. His employment was terminated immediately, for cause, with no severance. The board also implemented new policies. All executive outside business relationships required disclosure and approval. Compliance personnel were given direct board reporting lines for retaliation concerns, and vendor management underwent a complete third-party audit. Elizabeth called me into her office the day after Richard's termination was announced. "The board wants to recognize what you did," she said. "Arthur is recommending you for promotion to Chief Compliance Officer with a seat at executive committee meetings and expanded authority." I sat down slowly. "That's significant. You went up against a COO and a fraudulent vendor network, and you were right about everything. That's not just doing your job, that's protecting the entire organization." She paused, "But I need to ask, was there any moment when you thought about just letting it go? Taking the demotion, moving on, not risking your career?" I thought about that morning, sitting in my office with my finger hovering over the send button on that email to the board. There was a moment, I admitted, but then I thought about what my dad would say if I told him I knew something was wrong and stayed quiet. Some risks are worth taking. Your father would be proud. I hope so. 3 weeks later, I was officially promoted to Chief Compliance Officer. My first executive committee meeting was focused on rebuilding vendor management protocols and implementing enhanced conflict of interest screening for all senior personnel. Arthur pulled me aside afterward. "I need to apologize," he said. "I brought Richard in without proper due diligence. I was focused on operational efficiency and overlooked character questions. That was my failure." "We all made assumptions," I replied. "He had the right resume. But you didn't make assumptions when it mattered. You verified everything." He shook his head. "I've been running this firm for 17 years, and I learned more about leadership from watching how you handled this situation than from any business school course." "Thank you." It was the most personal conversation I'd ever had with him. I also received a letter from the Illinois Attorney General's office. James Sutherland had been arrested attempting to board a flight to the Cayman Islands. He was charged with fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. The investigation had uncovered that he'd been running similar schemes with executives at 4 other investment firms, collecting kickbacks for vendor contracts his shell companies provided. Total fraudulent revenue, over $3 million. Richard was named as a co-conspirator, facing both criminal charges and civil litigation from the pension fund that had sued his previous employer. Both of their careers were over. Looking back on that Tuesday morning, the email at 9:30 a.m., the choice I faced, the risk I took, I know I made the right decision. Not because it worked out well for me, though it did, but because the moment someone values their comfort over their integrity is the moment they stop being trustworthy. And in a business built on trust, managing billions of dollars of other people's money, that's not a compromise anyone can afford to make. The systems I built still govern how the firm operates. Every vendor relationship, every approval workflow, every compliance checkpoint carries forward the lesson from that morning. Some things matter more than efficiency, more than convenience, more than keeping everyone comfortable. Doing the right thing isn't always rewarded immediately. Sometimes it costs something, sometimes it costs everything, but it's always worth it. Because at the end of every day, the one person who has to live with your choices is you. And I can live with mine. That's the full story of how a demotion at 9:30 a.m. led to shutting down a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme. If this resonated, that subscribe button makes a real difference in bringing these stories to more people who need to hear them. The journey to 5,000 subscribers continues with everyone who believes these stories matter. Thanks for being here for this one.